right, welcome to this explainer on NCP-MCI 7.5, 10.7 ID Firewall and identity-based VDI policies. If you're an infrastructure admin gearing up for the 7.5 exam, you are absolutely in the right place. We're going to take our time today and really get into the weeds. We'll look at the mechanics, the specific configuration rules, and, most importantly, those highly testable edge cases of the Nutanix Flow ID Firewall. So let's get right into it.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with why ID Firewall actually matters, then walk through identity-based policies, and check out some real-world VDI examples. After that, we'll dive into common exam traps, look at edge cases and limitations, and finally, wrap up with the key facts you absolutely need to memorize.
Section 1. Why ID Firewall matters. Before we dig into the how, we really need to understand the why.
To really appreciate ID Firewall, you've got to think about the headache of the legacy model, right? We're moving away from legacy network-centric security. Historically, if you wanted to secure a desktop, you had to tie firewall rules to static IPs, MAC addresses, rigid VLANs, the whole shebang. Every single time a new desktop pool spun up or somebody switched departments, the network team had to jump in manually to update the access control lists. It was a massive operational bottleneck. But now, we're shifting into workload-centric security. This is dynamic, it's network agnostic. Security policies literally follow the virtual machine, completely regardless of the underlying network setup. And they do this based on logical VM groupings, specifically Active Directory or AD groups. It is an absolute game changer for managing secure access at scale.
So, what actually is the ID Firewall? Well, officially, it's an extension to Nutanix Flow that lets you, the infrastructure admin, write security policies based on the users and groups in an Active Directory domain that your VDI VMs are attached to. But in plain English, it means the whole process is automated. The ID Firewall automatically drops your VDI VMs into specific Prism Central categories the very second it detects a user logging in. It seamlessly maps your network security directly to their AD identity, which means zero manual, day-to-day intervention from your IT staff. Pretty cool, right?
Moving on to Section 2, Walkthrough, Identity-Based Policies. Let's actually map out how you apply these policies step by step. The setup basically flows in 3 distinct phases, and for the exam, you need to know exactly what happens at each one. Step 1, you import your Active Directory groups directly into Prism Central. Once they're in, they become native Prism Central categories under the key AD group. Okay, moving to Step 2, when a user logs into a VM on your Nutanix infrastructure, the domain controller registers that event. The ID Firewall catches that logon event at the domain controller and dynamically throws the VM into that corresponding AD group category. And finally, Step 3, your VDI flow policies take over. Since the VM is now categorized, Flow automatically enforces whatever inbound and outbound traffic rules you previously attached to that category. It's that seamless. Now, for this whole chain to actually work, Prism Central has to connect to your AD domain controllers to import those groups. But, and this is a big but, pay attention to this specific requirement. Flow Network Security demands an unencrypted connection on port 389 for LDAP to configure these VDI policies. It explicitly does not support encrypted LDAPS. I can't stress this enough. This is a foundational constraint in the architecture. We're going to circle back to why this is such a massive exam focus in a minute, but seriously, go ahead and plant that port number in your brain right now.
All right, Section 3, Real-World VDI Policy Examples. Let's ground this with a couple of concrete scenarios to see this dynamic mapping in action.
This perfectly illustrates why ID Firewalls is so powerful. Imagine you've got a huge pool of identical, non-persistent virtual desktops. In our first scenario, an HR user logs into one of those VDI VMs. The system detects it, maps the VM dynamically to the HR AD group category, and boom, just like that, the VM gets outbound access to secure payroll subnets. But then, let's say that HR user logs out. Later that afternoon, a developer logs into that exact same baseline VM. They get mapped to the dev AD group. Instantly, the VM's security posture completely shifts. It drops the payroll access and now allows outbound access to internal code repositories. And you, the admin, achieved all of this without touching a single VLAN or IP address. The security policy just follows the identity.
But what happens in the real world when you have users in multiple AD groups? Well, Prism Central handles this super elegantly. If a user belongs to multiple groups, it just places the VM into all of those corresponding mapped AD group categories at the exact same time. The resulting security policy applied to the VM is a strict union, basically a combination of all the inbound and outbound rules across every single group. So if that developer from our last example is also in an IT management AD group, that VM instantly inherits outbound access to the code depositories, plus whatever management access the IT group gets. It just effortlessly merges the rules.
Which brings us to Section 4, Common Exam Traps. We are officially entering the danger zone. These are the highly testable edge cases you absolutely must know.
Okay, this is a classic exam trap, so literally write this down. Nutanix Flow explicitly requires unencrypted LDAP, that's Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, on port 389. The source material is very clear. It will not support encrypted LDAPS connections on port 636. Now, in the real world, as an admin, your instinct is probably to use port 636 to enforce secure, encrypted traffic across your directory services, right? That makes sense. And that is exactly why exam writers use this as a trap. If a question asks you about securing the directory connection for VDI policies with port 636, you have to remember that it's currently an unsupported configuration.
Here is another massive gotcha: credential caching. Nutanix strongly recommends that you disable credential caching on all your VDI VMs. Specifically, you'd open up your Microsoft Group Policy Management Console, find the policy for interactive logon, number of previous logons to cache, and explicitly set that value to 0. But why? Let's break down exactly why this specific GPO setting is so critical for the ID firewall.
You really have to understand the chain of events under the hood here. The ID firewall completely relies on detecting logon attempts by monitoring the events directly on the domain controller itself. So if you leave credential caching enabled and a VM temporarily loses its connection to the domain controller, a user could still technically log in using their locally cached credentials. And because they logged in locally, well, no event is generated on the domain controller. And if there's no event, the ID firewall is entirely blind to the logon, which means your security policy completely fails to apply. By setting those cache logons to 0, you are forcing a domain controller verification every single time.
Moving right along, Section 5, Edge Cases and Limitations. Let's look at a few more structural boundaries that govern these features.
This is one of the most counterintuitive mechanics of the whole system, so listen closely. While a user logon is instantly detected and the VDI policy applies immediately, Flow ID Firewall does not detect user logoffs. Let me say that again because honestly it kind of sounds like a bug, but it's 100% intended behavior. Logoffs are not detected. The security policy applied to a VM persists entirely until the next distinct user logs on to that exact same VM. So, if a user logs out, that VM keeps all their network permissions until a totally new user logs in and overwrites them.
Building on that, you've got to remember the strict single-end user assumption. VDI policies are fundamentally built on the premise that only one single user is logged into the desktop VM at any given time. Why is that? Well, the ID Firewall engine maps an identity policy directly to the virtual machine's network interface. It physically cannot apply two conflicting user policies to the same virtual network card at the same time. It needs a strict, one-to-one mapping of an active user to a VM policy to keep the security posture predictable.
Finally, there's one big exception to the categorization rule. If a virtual machine already has an app-type category assigned to it in Prism Central, the ID-based security engine will completely ignore it. It won't categorize that VM based on AD groups, even if a user logs in. And this makes sense because app type defines the core function of the server or infrastructure, which, in the Nutanix hierarchy, correctly overrides a transient user identity.
Okay, we made it to Section 6, Key Facts to Memorize. We've covered a ton of ground, so let's quickly pull it all together.
Consider this your ultimate cheat sheet for the NCP-MCI 7.5 exam. Burn these 5 facts into your memory. Number 1. Only unencrypted LDAP port 389 is supported. No LDPS on 636, period. Number 2. You absolutely must disable credential caching on VDI VMs to ensure reliable domain controller logon events. Number 3. There is no logoff detection. The policy just stays there until the next distinct user logon. Number 4, always assume a strict one user per desktop VM limit. And number 5, remember that app-type categorized VMs will bypass ID-based categorization entirely.
As you finish up your exam prep, I want to leave you with this to chew on. Knowing that the ID firewall persists policies post-logoff, and that it explicitly requires unencrypted LDAP, how do those specific technical limitations fundamentally change the way we architect and secure zero-trust networks in a Nutanix environment? It's a pretty fascinating design challenge for any infrastructure admin.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and best of luck crushing your NCP-MCI 7.5 exam.